then much later down the line, TVNZ. The whakapapa and origins still go back to Te Karere. The native post became known as New Zealand Post Office and then divided into New Zealand Post and Postbank. Postbank has been sold as a state-owned enterprise. New Zealand Post was threatened to be sold in 1986, but the Ariki reminded the government that the origins went back to Te Karere, so they stopped that sale, but today they're looking at franchising each New Zealand Post. Radio New Zealand, after much controversy, sold as a state-owned enterprise. TVNZ, just been sold as a state-owned enterprise. Telecom, sold as a state-owned enterprise. Another venture our tupuna set up was known as Native Couriers. And it was known, we had our own native shipping, we had our own native transport. It is proved that we had this flag that allowed us free access to every British port. In the back of the British registered ships is actually all the names of our tupuna, the names of the ships, the names of the ports that they were registered at, which proves that we definitely had our native shipping, and they weren't just little ships, they were 3 and 4 master trading ships. Native transport became divided into two, being railways and New Zealand Road Services. Railways, one chain across, you may be aware, is still under ownership of the Māori nation. But it is still under lease, and the lease has never ever been broken. However, all the rolling stock on top of the railways has been sold as a state-owned enterprise for around 400 million, including all the buildings, but the land underneath is still leased. Right throughout the North Island and the South Island, the lease still remains at $1 a year. New Zealand Road Services became privatised, individualised, and then later on down the line we had a New Zealand Air Corporation which went through this whole process to be known as Air New Zealand and was sold off as a state-owned enterprise. Native shipping, once there was no pūtea to maintain anymore, became absorbed into what was known as the Union Steamship Company. We know that today as P&O Line. The whakapapa of the Aotearoa Bank, the Native Reserve Bank, set up in 1808 at Kororareka. It operated in Auckland when Auckland became the capital. It operated in Ahuriri, Napier, when Napier became the capital for a short time. It also operated in a place that we know within Tainui on one of our major motorways, the Waikato River, at a place called Cambridge. But every New Zealand post office was an agent on behalf of the Aotearoa Bank. In 1889, because of the many things that began to take place, it was agreed that the Bank of New Zealand, which is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, absorb the accounts from the Aotearoa Bank, but pay back to the Māori nation equity as in representation of population. It started back then, of course it never happened. In 1990, the Bank of New Zealand was sold as a state-owned enterprise. The whakapapa of Māori-owned land leased to the Crown. Really important because there were millions and millions and millions of acres of Māori-owned land leased to the Crown. The same land is what we see every month in a pānui called Crown-owned land with Māori interest. It was agreed then that the government would pay to the Māori landowner 6% of the value of the land, but the 94% would go into a land bank, and this is exactly where our land bank began. From there, it is all documented that the colonial government may use that land and use that 94% of the money for Māori health, Māori education, Māori welfare and Māori housing. And that's exactly what was set up. Native hospitals, native schools, native housing and timber mills, because it came under health, education, housing and welfare. The timber mills became defunct once all our forests were felled. There was nothing left. Native housing, Papakainga, became known as Māori housing, then it became known as state housing, and then it was known as Housing Corporation, and that's been privatised off. Native hospitals and native schools are still there, but they're actually being transferred into European title. Your major Aotearoa hospital here and all the major schools right throughout were originally native schools and native hospitals. From this land bank, there were huge ballots of land runs leased to buy to European. The majority of the South Island was made up like that. Every hydro dam is built on the land from the land bank with the money from the 94%. Acquisition lands which were taken for return servicemen lands and defence lands, taken from the land bank, and when the return servicemen lands were no more, they were actually gifted to the return servicemen for their lifetime. And when that return serviceman had passed on, then that land was to go back into the land bank to the original Māori landowner. We have second and third descendants from the return servicemen who are still on those lands but are innocent because they didn't know what the deal was. And then we have local hapu protesting and occupying lands because they remember that they were ancestral lands. Defence lands were taken for defence and they weren't to be used anymore. They were to go back into the land bank. We have defence lands being used as a raupatu settlement. And again, it's take from that original landowner and give to someone else. Forestry, right through this country, we have huge tracts of forestry. Not far from here, you have the largest man-made forest in the world, or in the southern hemisphere. And those lands, the forestry was actually taken from the land bank with the money from the 94%, and today we have multinational companies managing and controlling those lands, and again we have hapu protesting and occupying those lands because they remember those were ancestral lands. The whakapapa of native reserves. Native reserves came about by every legal purchase of land that the Crown did make. And they did make some legal purchases. 10% would be walked out by the hapu and kept aside as native reserves. Where these native reserves used to be is where the native villages were, where the favourite hunting grounds were, where the favourite fishing grounds were. And then alongside that, under the New Zealand Settlement Act, was set up townships. Today, the fragments of these native reserves are what we know as parks and reserves, regional parks and docklands. Department of Conservation. The whakapapa of wastelands. 1840 to Tiritia Waitangi. 1841, the first wasteland was passed and put in place. Wastelands was determined by any land that hapu iwi weren't living on were wastelands. But it was from these wastelands that our major resources, our forests, our minerals, our gold, were taken from what is known as wastelands. The same land is actually what is tossed between government and local government. And we have hapu jumping up in the middle trying to take back what belongs to them. The treaty contract to Tiritia Waitangi in 1840 as it was, and the treaty partnership as it still stands today. That in 1840 there was absolutely no question that the Crown of England was forming a contract with the Māori nation as their own sovereign nation. It was already recognised by the Crown of England that the Māori nation was its own sovereign nation. Ko Hoero Parliament, or Māori Parliament, was already operating as early as 1808. New Zealand Parliament did not get into place, put in place here in New Zealand until after the 1852 New Zealand Constitution Act. There was no governing body here in New Zealand because every non-Māori was actually governed by New South Wales. New Zealand government was put in place in 1859-1860, and it was put in place for non-Māori. It was already recognised and accepted in the 1852 New Zealand Constitution Act that Māori were already governing, managing their own affairs, and that it's actually in there, the New Zealand Constitution Act, which is an imperial act protected by a letter of patent, means that no government can change that particular act. However, in 1987, there was an amendment to that act, and if you look through it, you'll find there's absolutely nothing in there that is Māori issue in there. It is only the part that proclaims to European or non-Māori that has been amended. It has not been touched. A general electorate was set up, and it was set up for a tribe that became a legal tribe in 1840 called Ngāti Wikitoria. Ngāti Wikitoria, the descendants of England, Scotland, Wales or Ireland. And anyone else who came within New Zealand and was naturalised after 5 years became part of Ngāti Wikitoria. The manu that was gifted to Queen Victoria, the same as this manu here, is known as the manu of the taupuru. Within each of our hapu, within each of our iwi, we have a symbolic manu, bird, because that has always been very, very important to us as Māori. The manu that was gifted to Queen Victoria at the time of the treaty was the kotuku, the white heron. And if you look on government buildings today, you'll see a kotuku, a heron, white heron. Queen Elizabeth II today is still acknowledged as the lone flight of the white heron. And so that has always been known, it is still documented that this bird, this manu, was gifted to Queen Victoria at that time. Now if you think about how many of our New Zealanders who have migrated here from overseas since 1840 and it's 1999 today, you'll find that all those that actually make up Ngāti Wikitoria are a much, much larger population and majority than those who are represented as Māori electorate. In 1867, because of the many legislations that were being put in place in order to alienate our lands from us, it was important that our tupuna saw there had to be some monitoring in the New Zealand government or New Zealand Parliament. So in 1867 we had our first 4 Māori seats within New Zealand Parliament. It is 1999 and we've just got our 6th Māori seat. So the seats aren't keeping up with the population. We have a right as Māori to be on the general electorate or the Māori electorate, because the Māori electorate was only set up not too long ago. We have many Māori on the general electorate, we have Māori on the Māori electorate, and we have Māori out there who just given up with the system and they won't register at all, and I don't blame them. However, we had to test this. We tested it all the way through to make sure, is this what our tupuna really meant? Because I have only ever heard that our tupuna were brilliant. And at the time that they were setting up and agreeing to a treaty, it didn't happen on the 6th of February 1840. It took 6 or 7 years from this first contractual treaty way back in 1832. And so because Māori were on the general electorate as well as the Māori electorate, that partnership didn't quite seem right, because it's meant to be an equal partnership. So I'd like to introduce you to my husband, who I always use as a guinea pig. Sorry, Rob. Just stand up here, Rob. My husband, Rob, and he's Ngāti Wikitoria. What did is he went and registered himself on the Māori electorate. He registered as Ngāti Wikitoria and his waka being Te Kotuku. And there was jumping up and down in Wellington, said you can't do that because the Orange Book said you can't do that. However, they left him alone, and the next year he got a card asking if he'd like to transfer back to the general electorate, like most of us Māori who are registered on the Māori electorate. Now, the reason that we tested this is that it has been 1840, this partnership was like this. And over the years, this partnership has slowly been going like that, and it's climbing like that, and it's not stopping. And so it was bringing it back to what really was fair and what our tupuna really did mean by a treaty. It's about a partnership, and it's about a fairness, and it's about equality. So we've gone through this kōrero with many Ngāti Wikitoria associates and friends and relatives, and once they found out and realised just what it is that Māori are jumping up and down about, they also are registering themselves on the Māori electorate. It's just a history and information that I needed to share with you. In 1947, this whare here, Aotearoa Parliament, went into recess. And if you can see, there's only been one way for the Māori nation to go. And it has been totally within an arena whereby policies have been written by people who have no idea what it is that the Māori nation needs are, which is why today in 1999, the Māori nation is actually classed as a third world nation living beside a first world nation within an affluent country. Something did not work and something didn't go well because the people who were looking after the policies for health, education, housing, welfare did not listen or hear what the people were actually asking for. On the 28th of October 1997, this box here, Aotearoa Parliament, came out of recess. And the reason that it came out of recess is because I mentioned that the most powerful whare out of this whole structure was hapu. And this whole thing had to be picked up and reactivated by hapu. And so we went back exactly as we did with you right today in your whare, that the most important place that we needed to come right back to is the marae-based hapu, because that is exactly how our tupuna set it up, that our whare is the parliament, and that our whare stand and actually sit on sovereign land, that the marae is the sovereign land, that Māori customary law is exactly what happens there, that European law cannot enter into the whare or the marae of our different whare tupuna. And over the time, it has been very cleverly designed that we be taken away from something that is the most powerful authority for us as a Māori nation, and that is our hapu, our marae. During the 1950s, 1960s, the industry waved the carrot. We all went to the cities, we went to the towns, and we are now descendants of what we know as urban Māori. I'm an urban Māori. I live in Tamaki Makaurau. I don't live back on my grandfather's whenua, Maniapoto, and I don't live within Ngāti Pawa on my grandmother's whenua. I live in Auckland. And there are many, many of us that live in the cities because that is where we were taken to. The lands that were our tupuna lands were leased out, and then it came under what was set in place as the 1955 Trust Board Act. This is how the structure used to be before Aotearoa went into recess, and it was one of the most democratic, fair structure that used to be. That each of these circles represent a hapu, that each of these symbols here represent the marae or whare or pā, depending on how large our hapu are. That if this marae-based hapu over here wished to form a joint venture with that one, it was entirely within their right to do that. the profits, the resources remained at hapu level. That if this hapu here wished to form a joint venture with that one, because maybe their lands ran side by side, then it was entirely done at a hapu runanga level, but the resources and the profits remained at hapu level. If the whole iwi wished to do something, then it was done at an iwi runanga level, but everything remained right back down with hapu. In 1955, after Kohuiro went into recess, a very damaging act was put in place, and it was called the 1955 Trust Board Act. What that did do is it cut everything from here down away. Everything was held up the top. The Constitution is set up by the Crown or the government. The trustees are only accountable to the Minister of Māori Affairs. They do not have to listen to the people, which is why we're in the status of a third world nation today. And it is actually a government agent. What has happened, of course, is over many of the hapu who have been disenchanted with what is going on. It had been put through by many, but I'll let you know the way that we utilised the free carriage of Westminster and took it directly to the Crown. Although Kohuiro had gone into recess, it means in recess, it's not shut. There was one whare that was left open, and it was the ariki ahupiri o ngā kōhere. And we utilised the free carriage of Westminster and went through that way. And just in a simple term, it was like this. We went from hapu through this access that was still there to the Crown of England, who then informed New Zealand Parliament to put certain things back in place. Because the whole move towards phasing out the 1955 Trust Board Act was not through the aroha of the MPs in there. In fact, they all jumped up and down. It was actually from a higher order that came down. Now, last year, Te Puni Kokiri took this matter out to hapu iwi and asked hapu iwi if they wished to amend the act or phase the act out altogether. And we all put the submission through and said, nā hapu katoa, phase the act out, we don't want it, we want to go back to what our tūpuna originally had structured. And we are aware that by the year 2000, which is only a few months away, the 1955 Trust Board Act is phased out, and it is up to the hapu iwi then what they wish to do. So we've had many organisations being set up called runanga. And really what it was a group of people over here, and the trust boards moving over here, calling themselves a runanga, with the same constitution that holds everything up the top. So the hapu that we have been associating with and sharing this kaupapa was about it's the perfect time for hapu to set back up their hapu runanga and keep the empowerment right back down with the people. And that's exactly what we have been doing over the last few years. I'd like to just take this part into the next arena because, yes please, it really brings us up to where we are at right today. And I needed to take us through that history so that we see that the authorities that were in place way back then are still there for us to utilise as a Māori nation. I mentioned how everything is still in its full entirety within Te Whare Te Karere and in the House of St James in England. So this map here is exactly how it was in 1947 when Kohuiro went into recess. This is actually outlines the boundaries of the 7 main tribal areas. And if you can see, I'll point to it anyway, that these purple lines here are actually where the boundaries of the 7 main tribal areas, and I'll go through those with you. And this area up here is known as the main tribal area of Ngāpuhi. And while we're up here, I'd just like to say that every hapu, every iwi is no greater than any other. because when we get down around here somewhere, if you're from certain other main tribal areas, you might raise your eyebrows. So I just want to go through this because this is history, this is how it went into recesses, and this is exactly how we need to bring it out of recess. The main tribal area of Ngāpuhi is that area there. This area here is known as the main tribal area of Ngāti Whātua. This area here is known as the main tribal area of Tainui. And this area here is known as the main tribal area of Aotearoa. This whole area here is known as the main tribal area of Kahanunu. And that's what I mean. Kahanunu is no greater than Tūhoi or Te Whānau Apanui or Whakatōhia or Wairarapa. It is exactly how it was to define the 7 main tribal areas. This main tribal area, all this area here is known as the main tribal area of Te Aotearoa, which includes the Chatham Island, Moriori. And this area here is known as the main tribal area of Waitaha Katimamui. I just hear it actually, at that time Ngaitahu was actually up in here. Because it was important to look at reactivating what was in place by sticking totally with Māori customary law, because by doing that we could in no way be interfered with by European law. And that is why it was so important to bring that whole basis back to marae-based hapu, because on that sovereign land no European law can enter into there, and that is the mandate that our tūpuna had originally set up. From the 28th of October 1997, when I mentioned Kohuiro came out of recess, it didn't mean to say that we suddenly had all these authorities and everything was in place. We had a lot of mahi that had to be done. We had to actually find one hapu from each of these 7 main tribal areas to actually step outside the square and stand over here. And the reason I say that is because every marae is under an incorporated society under the Tūturu Whenua Act, which is actually under a government agent. And we had that handed over in 1947. So in order to come right back to sovereign Māori law, Māori customary law, we had to step outside of the government agent, come over here and set up another body, a legal body, in order for those hapu to stand on their own mana as a sovereign body to carry out Māori customary law. Now that body that was set up, a legal entity, was very important because from the incorporated society, which actually disempowers hapu, it actually disempowers hapu and allows another body to manage your resources and everything for you. It was to set up a body that was going to have the empowerment for hapu to carry out their commercial business, look after their own resources, and have vested back in them from this other government agent their resources. So what was set up was a charitable trust. The charitable trust being that, although we're talking Māori customary law here, it was important to equip the hapu with a legal body because all resources were stored out there. Now with that charitable trust, it was important that the hapu set up their runanga too. So we came down and we said, okay, we'll go with one. So within this area here of Ngāpuhi, there was a hapu